Historically, I think we can. It's just, I always find it a bit odd that someone would take that approach while also simultaneously.
No, but I'm saying if like in the first century AD, if a Roman emperor was lined up and to become Roman emperor, and he's a Christian, surely that's something that should raise red flags amongst all Christians. That why, if we're being persecuted throughout the first century AD, why is someone lined up to become Roman emperor who is a Christian? Sure, it doesn't play out like that. Sure, there's internal Roman politics that mean that figure doesn't become a Christian, doesn't become emperor. But if according to the Christian tradition, and I'm not going by the historical tradition, I'm going by the Christian tradition. So according to your own tradition, there's an emperor, or an emperor that.
Who's this, by the way, that you're referring to?
So there's the Emperor Domitian, who is from the Flavian dynasty. So maybe you know Vespasian, Titus. Are you familiar with either of those emperors? I give the background context, so like the whole thing makes sense, right? So you have Nero, who is a bit of a crazy person, but he is, according to the standard narrative, right? He's a crazy person. So he's going to war with the Zealots and the Sicarii, those kind of Jews in Jerusalem, in the Jewish revolt, right? So he's going to war with them. He sends Vespasian as his leading general to deal with that Jewish revolt and to quench it. Vespasian and Titus, they go and they demolish Jerusalem. They they demolish Jerusalem. They're going up to the Temple Mount, and the most prominent rabbi at the time, Yohanan ben Zakkai, he starts talking to Vespasian, and he's saying a mighty king was prophesied that he will come and destroy Jerusalem, and you're that mighty king in Daniel. At that exact moment, a messenger comes from Nero and tells him, the Emperor Nero's died, and he kind of takes that moment as a significant moment in his life to show that he's the promised Messiah kind of figure that's gonna, not the Messiah, but like a Messiah in the Jewish faith, that is gonna go and become Roman emperor. So he uses that as like a thing in his life. But yeah, so there's Emperor Nero, Emperor Vespasian, Emperor Titus, who is his son, and then Emperor Domitian, who is his other son. So, and Domitian's niece is so Domitian. Sorry, it's a lot to kind of put the context in.
I'm just wondering where this goes.
Yeah, sure. So basically, you get to Domitian, so the Emperor Domitian. He doesn't have any heirs, but he has a niece called Domitilla. And he says to Domitilla, I promise that your two children will become Roman emperor after me. Domitilla is Santa Domitilla in your early church tradition. I'm not sure if you've heard her name before, Domitilla. So she's a saint, she's a Santa according to the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. She's an early Christian martyr, so she's recognized as being a Christian. She married a guy called Titus Flavius Clemens, who's also recognized by the early church as being a Christian. And their two children are going to be raised Christian, right? If you have two Christians, their two children are going to be Christians. Those two children are promised to become Roman emperor in the first century AD by the Emperor Domitian. So, like, why during Vespasian and Titus's reign and Domitian's reign, why do they have Christian members of family? Why does it seem like there's no persecution of Christians under their reign? Because under Vespasian and Titus, there's no persecution of Christians according to Eusebius, Tacitus, and Josephus. So that's what I'm trying to say. Like, I asked you a question about like the martyrdom tradition.
It's also persecution. Yeah, like it goes back to pagan ideas of like incorporation. So when Romans, for example, would go and they would conquer new areas and they would encounter new religions, they would incorporate the religious beliefs so often because to them it made sense to do things that way.
Sure.
Because they're like, oh, we want to know about all the gods.
Yeah.
So
is that when like say they defeat an empire and then they I think historians have talked about them taking a figurehead of that empire and turning it into a god in their pantheon?
Yeah, they often did that, So from their perspective, Christianity is difficult largely because it goes against their values. It sounds a bit weird, but in the Roman sort of value system, strength is a value, like physical, like capacity to do things.
Yeah.
But in Christianity, meekness is valued. The idea that even though you could, you don't, and that really confused them. Largely because they thought, well, we know the Jews. We've had many encounters with the Jews. The Jews will fight us.
They weren't tolerant, and
the Jews will actively fight the Romans. They did, right? That's one of the reasons why the temple was destroyed.
Sure.
But Christians would actually rather die first.
Yeah.
And that really sort of confused them. There was also a lot of slandering. You can find stories of like Romans believing that Christians used to like drink blood and do weird stuff like that. But generally speaking, they just didn't appreciate the values that Christians had. They didn't see how they could incorporate it into an empire.
I think I tend to disagree with that in certain.
Like for example, Christians had a tradition of being very against gladiatorial games, right? Like first of all, Christians were often killed there.
Yeah.
And for the Romans, that was sort of like an ironic thing. You know, these Christians refused to fight. You know, they hate the gladiator game, so we'll put them in the gladiator.
What period in history are we talking? Like what gladiator games under which emperor?
I don't know actually.
Okay.
I'm not have anything in particular in mind, but in the early times, I think anyway.
Okay.
Because I'm sort of aware the gladiator games were around then, and it was the Christians that stopped the gladiator games through Constantine. Once they actually had some
like 325 AD.
Oh yeah,
much
later.
Sure.
Because they weren't a recognized viable religion, right?
Yeah.
You couldn't. You weren't an understood religion until you were the Edict of Milan.
I think you made a very interesting point about like the Romans incorporating their enemies' gods and taking them into the pantheon, right?
I think it's like Mars or something.
So there's also like Serapis. So Serapis is he's a fusion Egyptian Greek god that was still worshipped in the Roman times. So he was a fusion of Osiris and one of the Greek gods.
Sure.
You have like Mithra, for example, who's not a god, but like a figure, right?
Yeah.
Who is kind of a fusion Persian, Roman figure. Can you not see possibly them doing the same with Jesus and kind of having a fusion Judaic Roman figure?
No, I think what we do know historically is that Constantine was sympathetic to Arianism, for example. Constantine called the Council of Nicaea largely to settle the issue of Arianism.
Sure.
And he himself was actually more sympathetic to Arianism than he was to Trinitarianism, to the idea that the Son and the Father are the same substance.
Sure.
But he accepted the result of the Council, which was 316 bishops favouring consubstantial natures, and 2 going with Arius, literally Arius and his friend.
I'm talking like 300 years before, 250 years before Constantine. So like under like the times of the Jewish revolt, could you not see it fitting the agenda for them to incorporate one of the Jewish figureheads, turn him into a god in their pantheon, like they've done throughout wars, and kind of pacify that figure in order to fit the Roman agenda?
And you say around 70 AD?
Yeah. Around 70. When the Gospels are written.
Well, there's an argument to be made that they were made before that, during the 60s.
Sure.
It depends, because the reason why modern scholars say a later dating after
But even
70 AD,
the 60s, even like the mid 60s, the Jewish revolt's happening, is blossoming. So
sure, it is happening then. Yeah. But we didn't know the temple was going to be destroyed. Well, I guess that's fine.
Sure.
So first of all, Paul's letters actually predate that.
Yeah.
Paul's letters are said to be, well, we'll say between 40 and 50 AD, maybe somewhere around there.
No, I don't dispute
It depends on what letter. But ultimately, in Paul's letters, you have a high Christology. He's called the Son of God. He's said to have died. 1 Corinthians 15 talks about him dying and resurrecting. He actually quotes part of Luke's Gospel verbatim. There's a part in Luke's Gospel.
Kind of, but I mean, apart from that quote in Luke's Gospel, which is like kind of disputed, is there any other quoting of the Gospels in Paul's writings?
I'm not familiar off the top of my head, but
Okay.
the one that I'm
I
aware
don't think
of
there
is the one where Jesus at his Last Supper says, "This is my body, which has been given for you. This is my blood," so on and so on. I'm paraphrasing, but you can find that pretty much word for word in 1 Corinthians, I believe, chapter 11.
But do you not see it a bit worrying that that's like you can only find one quote of the Gospels in Paul's writings?
Quote?
Because he's meant to be like half your New Testament, and he's not quoting these Gospels. And you're saying that they're written when? The Gospels?
Well, I mean, it depends, right?
Yeah.
I would probably say 60 somewhere 60s. Is what I, apart from like John is probably 90.
Sure. Okay.
Um,
But with Paul, for example, as well, like, sorry, you're jumping a bit topics, but with Paul, like, for example, with there was a lot of dispute between him and the early church, right? So, like, for example, James sent people to correct the teachings that Paul was doing across the Jewish diaspora.
No, that's not. No, you're referring to Acts chapter 21, verse 21.
Yeah.
Basically, what happens is that Paul comes back with Barnabas.
Yeah.
And they just gone on they'd gone into Asia Minor, basically, in areas of Greece, to preach the gospel. And his ministry is largely to a Gentile ministry.
Yeah.
He went to the Gentiles. So when he came back, basically, what James says to him in Jerusalem is that they have heard rumors that he has told the Jews that they need to stop being Jewish, basically. They need to no longer do circumcision, no longer do any of this stuff. And he says in that chapter, in that very verses, he says, we know that's not true. We know that you didn't say that, but you need to convince them that you didn't say that, because they all think you did.
So then he makes them repent in the temple, right?
And then he takes the Nazarite vow.
The Nazarite vow. So doesn't that mean he's surrendering to James' opinion that he is teaching?
Well, no, he's surrendering to the idea that he needs to do something to show them he isn't anti-Jewish. He isn't like, hey, Jews, you need to give up circumcision. What he was saying is that circumcision is not what gives you salvation. But he himself is circumcised. He actually helps people get circumcised. But the point that he's trying to illustrate is it's perfectly fine to have Jewish customs. It's perfectly fine to do these things, but not in the context that it gives you salvation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But coming to you're saying Paul has high Christology. Why
I
would
think so? I mean, if you look at the letter of
could you not see Paul is pitching his idea. Yeah, Paul has connections to the palace apparently. Because I can't remember where in the Gospels he talks about say hello to my friends in Nero's palace. So he had some connections to Nero's palace. I can try and find it. Sure. But. But could you not? I'll try and find the verse. But
yeah, sure.
Could you not see him if he has connections to Nero's palace? It's in his interest, being a very Hellenized Jew.
Well, he was anyway.
He was, right, a Hellenized Jew.
Well, I mean, a lot of Jews were Hellenized because the Greeks had taken over 300 years prior.
So I think it's Philippians 1:13. Actually, maybe it's not that one. But yeah, what I'm saying is, if he's pitching to the Romans, to the Roman Gentiles and to the Roman aristocracy, could you not see it's in his interest to pitch an Apollo-like Jewish Messiah?
An Apollo-like Jewish
because at that time, Roman pagan worship was very heavily leaning towards Apollo.
The issue
so Nero he was very into the arts, so his favored god was Apollo. Vespasian and Titus that come after Nero, they are also very heavy into the sun god Apollo. And Apollo is known as the son of God because Apollo is the son of Zeus, the great god. So he's known as the son of God.
A lot of sons.
But Apollo is one of the big ones, and you can even see a lot of the imagery in the early church in line with the imagery of Apollo, for example. I think they found a signet ring that was in the Mediterranean somewhere or something like that, and it had an image of Jesus that looked very much like the image of Apollo. And that's but I'm just giving an example.
Don't get me wrong. I think that there is crossover in the sense of there are religious people who will
try and find this.
Muslims, right?
Sure.
If that's meaningful, I will actually ask that do you know the first caliph of the Umayyads? Muawiyah.
Yeah.
Muawiyah minted in his own up north in Syria, where they had mints that they had taken over. He minted coins with Christian crosses on them.
Yeah, but that was a transitional phase, right? So that was a transitional phase. It wasn't like he was minting that for that sake. he was minting that because that's how they were created, and they were familiar in the empire as being like that. So he was adding the Shahada to that as a way of slowly Islamifying it.
I thought in
later,
Islam that you can't have symbols. I mean, during like a caliph to make crosses seems very odd, basically.
but that's how it was minted, and like it's being used in the empire. It has a different significance.
These weren't already minted coins. He actually.
Yeah, but they were minted like that back then, right?
So they had his name on and stuff. You know?
Sure.
And
But
actually,
it was very
an
quickly.
icon of him. Sorry. This is. I won't go into that. But my point is. So.
But I think very quickly
we
it
were
was
talking about
very
Islamicity.
Islamicized very quickly after that.
No, it was by the end of the 7th century, so about 60 years.
60 years, yeah, sure. But that's like a massive, like these are dinars and all of this being used, dirhams and dinars, right? Being used throughout the empire, and you can't just like suddenly.
No, you can't, because he printed them.
Sure.
So, like, you would have thought that, you know, like for example, Muhammad.
Next week.
No, 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
But if we want to talk about symbology, I think.
Take care.
So like, the early church, one of their symbols was the dolphin and the anchor, right? Are you familiar with that symbol?
I'm familiar with the fish.
Because the dolphin and the anchor, originally, what it was used for was it was used by the Seleucid dynasty during the Maccabean revolt, and it used to signify Apollo.
Okay.
The dolphin was to Apollo's sacred animal, and the anchor was a ring that Zeus proposed later with that had an anchor insignia on it.
Yeah.
So this anchor and dolphin symbology is very heavily associated with god Apollo. When Vespasian and Titus become emperors way after, in 70 AD to 81 AD, they incorporate the anchor and dolphin into their coin minting, right? So they incorporate the same symbol that was used by the Seleucids in their coin minting. This symbol is also used by the early church at the same time in the same location. So why is the early church using the symbology of the emperor? That's like a question I have.
Do you know what point that was?
Yeah, that would have been like 70 to 81 AD. And like, for example, the catacombs of Domitilla. So
But 71, 80 AD, they didn't have the capacity. The church didn't own anything.
sorry, okay, let me, made a mistake. But so like, there's the catacombs of Domitilla, which are some of your earliest examples of Christian iconography.
Okay. Yeah.
In those catacombs, there's symbology of the anchor and dolphin.
Okay.
And Domitilla is the Emperor Domitian's niece, and the Emperor Titus's niece, I believe, as well, because they're brothers.
Yeah.
So, like, the Emperor's niece is using this symbol. Okay, so Vespasian and Titus use the anchor and dolphin. So the Roman emperors use the symbol, the anchor and dolphin. The early church are using the anchor and dolphin. And Domitilla is a member of the early church, and she's a member of the Roman family, the Roman emperor's family, and she's using the anchor and dolphin. So this anchor and dolphin symbol, could you not see how the early church is associated with the Roman Empire?
Well, I mean, you could interpret that in a totally different way. For
In
example,
what way?
there are groups like Gnostic groups that openly just took all Christian stuff. They loved Christian story. They literally wrote their own gospels claiming to be from disciples.
Yeah.
The Gospel of Thomas, for example.
Yeah.
So it's not to be unexpected that there would be people that would try and do that kind of thing. I mean, it took us a while to figure out that it was a specific group that predated Christians that had done this and had taken it onto themselves.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, again, it's, to be honest with you, like I find these things a bit difficult. In the same sense, like there's a typical like atheist thing where you mentioned the god Mithra, right? You know, the similarities between that and Christian belief, therefore they're somehow inspired.
Yeah.
I no. I mean, there are things that are like, for example, in the Old Testament, there are clear cases where the Israelite people took descriptions of pagan gods. For example, there was a pagan god who was referred to as a cloud rider, and they associated that with Yahweh by saying, actually, your god is the false god, our god is the true god, our god is the actual cloud rider, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they took that kind of usage and applied it to their own god. So there are cases where that sort of thing does happen. But I think when it's just, this sounds like this, therefore it came from this.
But I'm saying in like the emperor's family, like the emperor's niece is a Christian, and she is meant to heir the next Roman emperor in the 1st century AD, and he's meant to be a Christian. So the Roman emperor There's a time in the first century AD, towards the end of the first century AD, where the next in line is a Christian. Yeah.
Right.
This is all
why
happening
that
straight
did
after
happen,
the Jewish revolt, right? Sorry?
Do you know why that didn't happen? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so Nerva became emperor, and that was because of internal Roman politics, and he is outside that family, so the Flavian dynasty came to an end.
Is it because they didn't want a Christian emperor?
No, it wasn't related to that. So it wasn't that reason. It was because of something else. It was because Domitian, Domitilla, who is his niece, the Christian, she assassinates Domitian through an assassin.
Okay.
And the night before Domitian gets assassinated, he has a dream where he says the god Apollo, that his god, so Domitian kind of switches from the god Apollo to another Roman pagan god called Minerva.
Okay.
And he has a dream the night before he gets assassinated that the goddess Minerva cannot protect him anymore against the god Apollo. So he clearly associates the god Apollo with his niece Domitilla, who's a Christian. So what I'm kind of seeing from all this, is the Roman emperors that were very heavy on the god Apollo, they seem to harbor and seem to be very friendly towards Christians, seeing them as some sort of sect, maybe.
I don't think it's fair to say friendly. I mean,
but then where's the persecution for like?
No. I'm not talking about. I'm not saying they were persecuted like actively.
Yeah.
I'm saying they aren't considered a genuine religion. I mean, like they're considered a sect of Judaism for a long time.
Yeah, that's what.
And again, they saw them as odd and weird and icky, basically.
But do you not think that they saw them as advantageous as a very pacifist religion in a time when they're at war with the Jews, and they're at war with people who aren't integrating, people who aren't practicing their customs, people who aren't worshipping their gods, and they see these Christians and they see them as someone who is very beneficial in the war against Judaism, in a way?
No, not really. To be honest with you, I don't see much of a thing there. I mean, maybe there's stuff that I've missed, but to be honest, it seems as if there are probably other explanations you can give for that are probably a lot more simplistic.
Like what?
You know, Occam's razor, right?
Yeah.
You don't multiply sufficient causes beyond necessity.
Sure.
I would say
But,
Occam's razor.
like even Justin Martyr, for example, when he preaches his way after, and he's like, we're not preaching anything new, right? When he's talking to the Romans.
Right.
He's saying we're not preaching a new religion, like we're just doing the same things that you Roman pagans have done.
Did he say that? Like, in that context, like it's
I think it's in that context, right?
If you could find me that,
Sure.
I'd be very interested. We're not teaching you anything new.
Yeah, and it's just interesting for me, like, that it's very quickly established that the early church is in Rome,
Right.
where the emperor's family are Christian, and it's just happening at the same time. It's very interesting. Like, surely the early church should be in Antioch and in Jerusalem.
Well, it was. You
Yeah,
understand that Paul went and established his church in...
Yeah, but I'm saying, why is Peter given the authority compared to those kind of figures? Why is the church based on Peter when you have like James in Jerusalem, when you have like these figures in Antioch?
Rome didn't have the like authority it does now as like the prime power. In the early church, yeah, like it took a while for that to develop. Basically, that wasn't an initial thing. Yeah,
And
I mean, to be honest with you, they all sort of shared, as far as my understanding anyway.
Sure.
Like sort of equal authority-ish as just the patriarch, like the patriarchs. They were called the Petrarch, literally Petra meaning five.
Yeah.
Because there was like five of them: Antioch, Rome, Alexander. There's two more. Constantinople was one, and Ephesus. I don't know. I'm guessing at this point, but.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, you see, because one of the things I like to do is I like to study Islamic history from a revisionist perspective.
Okay.
And I think there's a lot of fertile ground because there's a lot of things that are very difficult to explain in the standard way that it's explained, right?
But I'm saying, like, I'm applying, sure, but I'm saying, like, can you not see the same thing happening in Christianity? So, for example, you have the Jewish revolt where, like, according to Josephus, which is probably an exaggeration, but 1.2 million innocent civilians are killed in Jerusalem alone in the Jewish revolt, right? This is like a mass tragedy in first century Palestine. It's not just Jerusalem which is targeted, it's all of Palestine. And this is all happening at the same time the Gospels are written. And then we hear about one of the figureheads in this region, and the earliest we hear about this figurehead in this region is it's written in Greek, which is the language of the conquering army. So that's like in Crimea, for example, say there's a figurehead that's fighting the Russians, and then the entirety of Crimea is obliterated, and the first thing we hear about this figure that was in Crimea, that's written in Russian.
The problem with that, though, is that Greek was the language for hundreds of years before, because again, they were Hellenized hundreds of years before by the Greeks, long before the Romans got there.
But even if you look into the figure of Jesus of Nazareth,
Jews were using Greek then.
Yeah.
Like we have Greek inscriptions by Jews.
Yeah. But if you look into the preaching of Jesus of Nazareth, right? He is he's from Nazareth, right?
Yeah.
He's from Nazareth, which is a very poor region of Galilee.
Yeah,
very small.
Village,
And when he comes back to Nazareth, after he has his ministry those 3 years, when he comes back to Nazareth, he sees Nazareth Hellenizing, basically. So there's these new Hellenized towns popping up around Nazareth, and the whole economy of Galilee is basically shifting towards accommodating those Hellenized cities, right? And that's Jesus specifically avoids, according to the New Testament, and the tradition, he avoids those Hellenized cities. He goes across the Sea of Galilee, preaching to fishermen, people who are impacted by these Hellenized cities.
Tell me where this is found. Where are you quoting from?
Yeah. So I'm quoting from Reza Aslan's book Zealot.
Okay, but are you quoting from a gospel?
From a gospel, just the fact that he's preaching across the Sea of Galilee. His first disciples are fishermen.
Okay, so this is inferred from the fact that the places he went to that we know about were not places
which weren't Hellenized places, right?
Yeah, but
so
again,
I'm saying why he specifically looks to be avoiding these Hellenized cities. His message seems to be very anti-Hellenized.
Do you understand how that's really problematic though? That would be like me saying, did you know that Jesus didn't go to any town with the letter Z in it? Don't you think that's significant? You understand how you'll laugh at me if I said that. You'd be like, come on, Chris, that's not obviously not a thing. But this is what happens when you take things and you basically go, right, there must be a pattern here.
But there is a pattern that he's specifically avoiding.
I can make patterns. We can all make patterns.
Yeah.
The point is that you need more than just that to validate your understanding, right?
Sure.
Because in all honesty, I could do the same with Islam, and I don't because I have to accept that there is a reason as to why Islam started the way it did.
Yeah.
Right? They have traditions, and I have to give them weight, and I can't just be like, well, okay, because I think there's patterns, I'm therefore going to throw all this away.
Sure, but then there's a pattern like the fact that.
I don't want to address your point as well, by the way.
Sure.
So you said that the gospel was written around 70 AD, about the same time that the Jewish revolt was happening.
Yeah.
The issue you're going to have there is that the oral tradition predates the written tradition. So again, like in Islam, that you'll have to figure out a way of explaining the oral tradition.
Yeah.
The other problem is that...
Sorry, and the oral tradition, you mean the apostolic tradition?
What I mean by the oral tradition is just the Gospels being said.
Okay.
The issue that you're also going to have is Paul's epistles are written to churches.
Yeah.
So it would be very odd if Paul was fabricating things or making stuff up if he's writing a letter to people who supposedly already agree with all the stuff he's saying. Right?
Yeah. No, I'm not.
And
I'm saying
pretty far away.
So I'm saying that for me, there's an element of the early Christians who were based in Jerusalem, who were very Judaized. They were practicing of the law, and they were wiped out. This tradition of Christians, like the earliest form of Christians, who come off James and these early disciples, they were wiped out in the Jewish revolt. And the Jewish revolt had a massive impact.
I don't know if they were wiped out. But
I can give you some sources on that.
As in, you think that they were... Wait, what does that mean? That means that... Are you saying there were certain early church fathers that were killed in it or something? Wait,
yeah.
What do you mean?
No, I mean for example, followers of James and these kind of Christians.
James, okay. They were killed in that.
So for example, I can give you some quotes just to make it. No, we're just talking about the influence of the Roman Empire on early Christianity, the influence of Roman paganism on early Christianity, and stuff like that. I know it's been drifting a bit. But...
Higher critical study of religions.
Yeah.
I guess.
So, for example, there's a book, Fall of Jerusalem, by Brandon. I can't find the second name.
Can I ask, does the author... you may be saying a new author there, but does the author you said before, does he accept Jesus existed?
I'm not sure on that point. But yeah, he basically talks about the fact that he argued that Christians in Jerusalem were willing participants in the Jewish revolt and were destroyed as a result of the revolt. and that kind of allowed for this Pauline version of Christianity to take over.
Well, the issue you have again is that there are
Because you can see
churches-
Judaism was massively impacted by the Jewish revolt, right? So they couldn't
it
perform
was.
the
Yeah,
temple
Judaism
tradition.
was massively
They had to
impacted.
adapt their religion to kind of shift away from that temple
Oh, they did.
tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, you had sorry, the words are just
No worries.
the issue you have is that Paul is writing to churches before this that
Yeah.
are already established, that already agree with what he's saying. Because otherwise, it makes no sense. Like, if I wrote to you a letter talking about things that you had never heard of, your first thing would be like, "What has happened?" Like, you would be concerned, basically.
Sure.
And given that Paul travelled to these places, it seems to make sense that
Yeah, but there is a friction there, right, between like James. For example, are you familiar with like the pre-Clementine writings? Pre-Clementine.
what do you mean by that?
I can't remember what the word is. I can show you what I mean. But... So, am I taking up too much time? Or?
well, I'm probably have to.
Okay.
There's some people over there somewhere.
I can't find it right now, but it's like the Clementine writings basically, and they're like dated to like the early first century, and they talk about not early first century, like early second century, late first century, and they talk about this massive tension between James and Paul, and Paul and the rest of the disciples. So like there is clearly like a tension there, right? Do you accept that of Paul and the disciples of Jesus?
There is something you can find in, I think it's the first chapter of Galatians, where Paul talks about Peter and how he disagreed with Peter.
Yeah.
And he gives a story of an event that happened, basically.
Sure.
But no, I mean, I don't think it's fair to say that they were like
and I feel like
somehow- yeah.
also like this Jewish revolt, like it had a massive impact on early Judaism.
It definitely did,
and
yeah.
it changed the religion,
Absolutely.
it shaped it.
Destruction of the temple. Yeah.
I'm saying the same thing happened with Christianity. Christianity was a very Jewish Christianity. It was very practicing of the law. It was very in the vein of Jesus, I believe. And then what happened is, after the Jewish revolt, when the Christians were fighting the Romans, according to some sources, the original true Christians were wiped out, and they were replaced by more. Then the only thing the early church in the diaspora had was the writings of Paul, because they could only build a religion off the writings of Paul, because that's how they saw things, right? That's how they saw things. That Paul's message is the only type of message that can exist now in this world of a destroyed
so think
Jerusalem.
about it now. So the letters that Paul writes, he writes to Corinth,
Yeah.
right? Which is, I believe, in Greece.
Yeah.
He writes to Philippians. He writes to the church in Rome.
Yeah.
So you would have to explain how all those places have churches in them that all agree with the same basic ideas.
But didn't he say, I've won a lot of these churches for you? Like in one of his writings, he talks about how he's won these churches from a different ideology.
A much more simpler explanation is simply that he went there, because that's what Acts says. He went to these places.
Sure.
He established churches, and he's writing to them about things that they've already discussed. I mean, that's a very simple, easy explanation. Like, if there was an equivalent in the Islamic perspective, I'd just accept it, because it's simple.
Yeah.
It makes sense. What I question are things that are difficult, not the things that are simple.
Oh, I understand. Like I'm just talking in terms of like the Gospels.
Yeah.
I find them very anti-Semitic in the way that they put a lot of blame on the Pharisees. They put the blame on the Pharisees as having killed God, for example, according to that, your understanding, right? And stuff like that. So
there is a
whereas
verse
like
in-
there's Jesus. According to the Gospels themselves, he gets a lot of help from the Pharisees, and he seems to be preaching a message to the Pharisees. He seems to be like,
His ministry does include preaching to Pharisees. Yeah, definitely.
and the way the Gospels portray Pontius Pilate as some kind of like saint, right? I believe he is recognized as a saint in one of the Ethiopian churches.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I don't know that. That's
So-
interesting. But no, Pontius Pilate.
Whereas he was a really ruthless person who was actually disciplined by the Romans.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy, Pontius Pilate. But yeah, like he in the Gospels, he's kind of described as a coward.
I don't think so.
Really? Like, I mean, he literally he bends to the call of the Jewish people, saying, like, give us Barnabas, right?
Yeah.
Like we and crucify Christ. And
Yeah.
he does. He just goes, I'll wipe my hands with it. You've said it.
Yeah, but he wouldn't have been a figure like that, because there would have been many messiahs going on at that time, and he was very brutal, and he was like, as you said, right? He was disciplined by the Romans for being extremely brutal in Judea. So why would he be someone who's like so willing to give this Messiah a stage and willing to give him a trial and wiping his hands off any blame? That doesn't fit with the figure of the historical Pontius Pilate at all.
Well, in what sense?
The fact that he's a really brutal person who would be killing Jews in their thousands. Why would he give one Jew?
You can be brutal, but also just not care.
Yeah, but doesn't that kind of seem like, yeah.
I mean, to be honest with you, I would just say, yeah, he doesn't care. Like, it's not his affairs.
Okay.
Like, he was brutal towards Jews, yeah, absolutely. But in the same sense, you know, the Jews have come to him saying, we have a problem with this one Jewish person.
Yeah.
Who, and then according to, they would have basically told him that he was claiming to be the king of the Jews.
Yeah.
Because that was their way of getting him interested in this. Because that is something he would care about.
Yeah.
Because that's a claim on authority, right?
Well, not necessarily, because
who's
there was like the Egyptian, the Samaritan, Simon Kokhba later. There were so many Jewish messiahs that were claiming to be Jewish messiahs.
No. The problem isn't the Messiah. So it's the king of the Jews.
Yeah.
Because king means Lord. It means Caesar. In other words, what the Jews basically describe Jesus as to Pontius Pilate is,
Sure.
this man claims to be our Lord, and we should follow him in contrast to Caesar. Because I don't know. There's a part in the Gospels where the Pharisees go up to Jesus and they say, should we pay our taxes?
Yeah.
And the idea is that it's a trick because,
Yeah.
you know, basically, are you saying that the Jews should follow Caesar as their Lord or Yahweh as their Lord? And either way, he's going to get in trouble. So,
And that point there. So that's straight after he goes and he flips the tables in the temple, right?
I can't remember exactly when.
So I think it's a bit after then that he's done a very anti-establishment act by going into the temple with a following, flipping tables, releasing animals. That's a direct opposition to the high priest of the temple, right? He's basically saying, I'm the authority, not you. The high priest is put in that position by the Roman authorities.
Okay, yeah.
So him doing that action is an anti-Roman action as well. So the Jews, a few days later, they go up to him and they'd put that challenge to him, right? His response, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. The way that's traditionally understood, it seems to ignore the actual Greek, so I can't remember the actual Greek from the top of my head. I can catch up with you on it later, but he's saying give to Caesar what's Caesar's, so he's kind of distancing himself from that Roman image on that coin, right? Because at that time, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a dispute about whether the Jews in that region could use Roman coinage because it has an image of the emperor who's claiming to be God.
I'm not sure.
So there's, I think that's why there was a dispute as well, that there's these coins that we're using that have like a fake God on it. Are we allowed to use that, or is it idolatry? And a lot of the Jews in that region who were like Orthodox, they would be like, no, we're not allowed to use these coins. So that's also a reason why they asked him that question, like, are we allowed?
I don't know what they would use alternatively, because again,
they were minting some coins in the temple as an alternative, I believe.
Okay.
So
Yes.
because you couldn't bring Roman coinage into the temple.
Yeah, but minting coins in a temple, I don't know.
I'm not. I can. Yeah.
Mints tend to be big operations.
Sure,
right?
sure.
But, I don't know.
But I might be wrong there. But yeah. So with so when he says give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give back to God what's God's, he says give back to God what's God's.
Sure.
So that's in the Greek.
Sure.
What he's saying, give back to God what's God's, Reza Aslan interprets that as being give back Jerusalem and Palestine back to God.
Okay.
What's God's. And then they see that as an act of rebellion. So they're basically checking if Jesus is a rebel against the Roman Empire and against the authorities, right? So after his temple destruction, well, not destruction, but like vandalism. So they ask him this question. He confirms that he is a zealot against the temple authorities and against the Roman Empire. A few days later, they come to his forces and then they arrest Jesus. There's a little scuffle, and then they crucify him as a bandit, right? As a lestai, which in the Greek means bandit. They would only crucify someone as a lestai if they are a rebel to the Roman occupation.
Yeah, which is how the Jews described him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's very anti-Roman. So he's very anti-Roman, right, as a figure.
What do you mean by that? He was very anti-Roman.
So he's very anti-establishment. He's very anti the Jewish.
Well, no, I don't think you can say
he's very
anti-establishment.
He's anti the Sadducees, right? And the Sadducees are Roman puppets in a way.
Well, I don't think he was anti like any specific group. Like he made anti-Pharisee statements.
But why would he make anti-Pharisee statements when that's the people. He says, doesn't he say to the Pharisees, we are equal? You should equal the Pharisees in righteousness.
Doesn't he say to the Pharisees, you should equal the Pharisees in righteousness? Wait, what do you mean?
No, I'm not sure, but doesn't he talk about the righteousness of the Pharisees in terms of them practicing the
law?
law?
The whole thing is that the Pharisees have taken the law, the Mosaic law, and they have basically gone out of their covenant by applying additional laws. They have effectively hyper-religionized themselves. So basically, there's a lot of stories you can go into this.
Sure.
Jesus is basically saying, look at what they do.
Yeah.
What they're doing is just for show. They want to be perceived as righteous.
Yeah.
They're not about actually being righteous. They want to be perceived as such. And he gives an example of a woman who gives a very small amount of money in donation into charity, right?
Sure.
Temple. And they scoff and they're like, we give so much more than she does.
Yeah.
And his point is that she gave everything she could, whereas they only gave a fraction of what they could have.
Yeah.
And there's others as well. But to say that he's like anti-Roman or
Well, I'm saying, okay, I know. I'm saying like this. There's clearly, for me, there's a massive ignoring of the fact that there's two factions at play in Jerusalem at the time. There's I'm separating them. So there's the Sadducees and the Herodian Jews, which are allied with the Roman Empire. And then you have the Pharisees, the Zealots, and the Sicarii, who are very anti-Roman occupation. The Roman Empire goes to war with the second faction, and Jesus' messaging, it seems to be, if you look at it historically, it seems to be towards this second faction. But he's being shifted away from the second faction in the Gospels, and he's being shown as being in opposition to the second faction at the time the war is happening. The Pharisees, the Zealots, and the Sicarii. So he's basically like in the Gospels and in the Christian tradition that comes about later, is showing him as being like against these strict Torah Orthodox Jews. Whereas he is a Torah Orthodox Jew, he seems to be saved a lot of times by the Pharisees throughout the Gospels. He has followers amongst the Pharisees. Why is he so anti-Pharisee and why is he so anti-Torah Orthodoxy, according to the Gospels and according to the Christian tradition?
I don't think he is in the sense of...
The reason I'm saying he is because the Roman occupation, a few years later, after he disappears, completely obliterates Jerusalem. Because of these, to them, these people are extremists, and they take this figurehead of Jesus, they pacify him, and then they bring him back to the pantheon in a way, like, that's what I'm trying to say. That's what's happening.
The problem with that is that there's a much simpler explanation, which is just that he did have issues with the Pharisees, and that did occupy a large amount of his time.
Yeah.
The Pharisees were a dominant group at his time, and therefore it was appropriate for him to do so. I mean, it's difficult because there's even stories where he helps the Romans, like he heals a centurion's son, for example. The Samaritans, he spends time with a Samaritan woman. Again, it doesn't seem like he's against anyone as such. He's against behaviours.
And also you touched on Jesus Barabbas, right? A bit earlier. So it's very interesting to me that there is in the Gospels themselves, there is a Jesus, Son of the Father, who has a massive following amongst the Jewish... Yeah, sure. But it's interesting to me that in the Gospels themselves, there's a figure called Jesus, Son of the Father, who has a massive following amongst the lay Jewish crowd in Jerusalem, and he is released and saved from crucifixion, right? And he's a very anti-Roman, anti-establishment figure, Jesus, Son of the Father.
Yes. So some theorize that he may have been the leader of the rebellion.
Sure.
And that Barabbas may be a nickname, basically.
Okay. So why is his nickname Son of the Father, and why is he released opposed to Jesus Christ?
It may have been because who was the head of the rebel before? In other words, it's a sort of play on words with the fact that he's his son. But that's literally it. It's possible it was a name, because the issue is that Abba, father, is a very common name.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a merge of two things. It is very unusual.
It's very unusual. Why would you be called... Yeah, sure, there's like... son of David or son of Goliath. Why would you be called son of the Father?
So this is why there's a scholarly view that it's a nickname. It's like something that people knew him by because of something he had done.
Okay.
It's
very unusual, and it's also interesting the way that he's chosen to be released, although he's depicted as being some kind of psychopathic Sicarii, right, who goes and stabs anyone.
I don't remember reading that in the Gospel.
Yeah, sure. No, but I mean, like, that might come from the tradition, but maybe, like, he's seen as like he's seen as a bandit and as a danger to the average Jew, right?
I could be wrong. Maybe the Gospels themselves say he was part of it, or maybe that's the theory.
Yeah.
I think it does say something about what he did, but I can't remember what. So
Okay, but it's just interesting that they're releasing someone who's a danger to the state, and they're crucifying someone who's not supposedly as big a danger to the state.
Well, it would make sense in the context of if this guy was like doing something against the Romans, then the Jews probably wouldn't have any issue with him, but they would have an issue with Christ because he's proclaiming to be the Messiah, and he's claiming also to be God.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, that's recorded in the Gospels, right? He was claiming to be God, according to the Jews.
And so I know you have to go. I just got one last question about. Are you familiar with like the earliest church fathers? So who is the earliest church father?
I'm learning at the moment. I'm studying
Okay.
patristics in my own time.
So who is like the earliest church father you have?
Oh well.
I mean, I know it's a debatable like terminology, church father, but I mean, like, could you say Clement of Rome?
So we have like right. Yeah, that's one of them. There are three: Ignatius, Polycarp, and Clement of Rome.
Clement of Rome. Okay.
Three main sort of like.
So Clement of Rome, he, like, from what I've read, he's associated with a figure Titus Flavius Clemens up to the 19th century. The figure Titus Flavius Clemens as being like that historical figure.
Up to the
19th century.
19th century.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, like the pre-Clementine writings, I believe, they talk about this figure, Clement of Rome, as being this figure. And this figure, Titus Flavius Clemens, either it being him or being basically a servant of Titus Flavius Clemens. This figure, Titus Flavius Clemens, he is meant to be the husband of Domitilla. So he's meant to be the great nephew of the Emperor Vespasian, and he's meant to have married his cousin Domitilla. So, is it a problem for you if your earliest church father is a member of the Roman Emperor's household, and he's married another member of the Roman Emperor's household, and his two children are meant to be the Roman Empress after him?
I don't think so. No.
That's not an issue.
I'm not. Well,
I'm not saying it is him, but I'm saying it's associated as being him, and it's also associated as Clement of Rome being a servant of.
So again, only because I'm looking at this now.
Yeah.
There's something called the Marcionite Chronicle
Sure.
that mentions Muawiyah praying at the site of Golgotha, which is the place where Jesus was crucified.
Okay.
That's not what a Muslim does. But you know, like, it's just weird. It's just very weird. Now we don't know how to explain that as historians.
Sure. But they're contested reports. They're contested reports.
See, this is proof that Muawiyah was a diehard Christian.
Yeah.
And I would be pushing that. Do you understand?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes you just have to say, look, I do think that this does tell things about his earliest.
No, but I'm not using the historical. I understand what you're saying. You're coming from the historical approach, and you're saying like it's double standards. But I'm saying your church tradition, so the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition, recognize Domitilla as being a Christian, and they recognize Domitilla as being a niece of the emperor.
So they're Christians. Why is that problematic?
That's problematic because, like, Domitilla's two children are promised to become Roman emperors. According to the Emperor Domitian, like he wants Domitilla's two emperors.
So there could have been a point where there could have been a Christian emperor much sooner than
than and then we're taught this thing about like martyrdom tradition and Christians are persecuted throughout. Like
you asked me at the beginning, I was like, it's kind of a misconception.
Yeah. Okay.
Persecution came in waves.
Sure.
And it was like localized.
Sure.
Like active persecution, actively going around getting. You can say there's like a passive persecution in the sense that, you know, it's not a dominant religion. It's seen as a weird sect of Judaism.
But it's just I'm sorry, just to finish up. So like, there's Christian, there's members of the imperial household who are Christian, right? And very influential members of the imperial household are Christian. They are using the same symbol as Apollo, and the Roman emperor at the time, he's also using Apollo's imagery. So there's like a link to paganism in early Christianity, right?
Well, I mean, technically, like, pagans have always grabbed whatever they could. That's kind of their thing, right? So it shouldn't surprise us if you find people in history who, like, were pagan and wanted to just borrow Christian symbols.
No, I'm saying the other way around. I'm saying Christians are borrowing Roman pagan symbols.
Yeah, I mean, in some situations, I think that can happen. Like, Christians
I agree. You can borrow pagan symbols, but at the same time, using it in the same time, in the same context for your same God, that's issue for me, right?
I mean,
like these guys are saying.
What do they think it meant? Like, what were they symbolizing?
It symbolized Apollo.
Yeah, so again, they're pagans, aren't they?
And it's just, to me, what it seems like is
if
they're taking this figure of Jesus, they're bringing him into the pantheon in a way. They're making him a more Catholic version of the god Apollo, a more Catholic being more universal version of the god Apollo. So like this figure, we can turn him into a more universal version of the god Apollo. We can turn him into a fusion god figure, like we turned Serapis into a fusion when we invaded Egypt, and we kind of took the Egyptian, when the Greeks invaded Egypt and they took the figure.
An explanation of this could
Osiris.
just be that there were Christians, pagans,
Yeah.
who worshipped Apollo, who became Christians, and then went, wow, I've seen lots of like
Similarities, sure.
So I'm going to contrast them and make symbols because I
Sure,
think,
sure,
you know,
okay.
I mean, people do that.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting that so there's that like kind of paganism element there, right?
Well, in the sense that if you were formerly pagan and you were
Yeah.
transitioning to be a Christian,
Yeah.
and you notice similarities, you could be like, yeah, people do things like that.
Okay.
I mean, you know, it's a human thing to do. To suggest that this is somehow like revealing some secret revisionist history of Christianity, I think that's.
No, I'm not saying it's like a secret. I'm saying like it's just something that's not talked about enough. Like, like
Well, I
the
mean,
fact
like,
that like
exactly.
the early church saints, they are members of the Roman Emperor's
Right.
family.
Okay,
That, this,
well.
like, this kind of-
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go, but just before I go, if we were to look at this consistently,
Yeah.
the Islamic, I mean, you know, like the Umayyad caliphates had like, in their own royal courts, like
Yeah.
pictures of naked women and wine.
Sure.
Like,
If they did, they did. But
Yeah, they
they're,
did,
they're
like,
not.
from
But they're not the
archaeology.
Rashid. They're not like from the fourth rightly Gali collection.
They're not, no, they're not. They're from the Umayyad period.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
but my point, and it's a lot further north. But
And popes made mistakes, right? Popes made mistakes.
yeah, I would say that's it. So, to me, that's not. I mean, it's an interesting part of history, right?
Yeah.
But I have to be realistic and want to derive from that. And part of what I'm interested in is what can I derive, what can't I derive. So I would suggest when you read these books, no worries, but contrast it with modern scholarship. What do modern scholars like? Be mainstream as much as you can,
Yeah.
and to give good reasons for what you think, and not just try to like.
Yeah, I understand, and also I
understand.
just find it's just very unusual that like sometimes the only sources we can find about the early first century Palestine is based off Josephus, and Josephus himself is a traitor to the Jewish people because he defected from the Jewish revolt to the Roman emperor's side, and that's why he's called Flavius Josephus. He got given that title because he associated himself with the Flavian dynasty, right? So like this is clearly a very biased source, right? Because he's defecting to their side, he's making up all these stories about he's the only guy who survived. All of his companions stabbed each other, and
the
he's the
issue
only
with
guy
it
who
is
came out
that,
the well.
It's never as clear cut as things, right?
Yeah.
There is a case in Josephus for Christians later changing part of it. There's a very specific verse where he says something like, it's something about Jesus being God, and it looks as if someone must have edited that in.
Yeah.
Because it would be very odd for Josephus to say that, given that he wasn't friendly to Christians. But historians generally agree with everything else. It's just that one verse that they're suspicious about, where they'll be like, Josephus did know about Christians, and he did write about Christians. So yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for the conversation.
No worries, no
Patrick.
worries.
I
Thanks
really
for
appreciate
the
it.
earlier discussion about Islam as well. That was
Yeah,
quite
no
nice.
worries. I hope we have.
Yeah,
more
sure. And
conversations in
hopefully
the
next time we can talk about something more unifying as well. Like,
Sure.
yeah, like I think last time we talked about Zechariah 11:17, and it talking about like a figure of the Antichrist. In I don't know if you remember.
I don't
But
actually.
yeah, it was just interesting. Like the figure of the Antichrist in Zechariah 11:17, it talks about him having one arm and having one eye, and the parallels of that with the Islamic version of the
I was gonna
Antichrist.
say, that reminds me of the Dajjal.
Exactly, and the fact that like, yeah, it's like trying to unify on those kind of parameters that we have the same enemy, we're not each other's enemy. Also, when you look at the writings of the Second Vatican Council and the way that they talk very positively about Islam, about
When you
how
say the Second Vatican Council, you mean Vatican II?
Vatican II, yeah. Vatican II, and the way it says that interfaith, like there's been a lot of issues between Muslims and Christians throughout history, but we have to ignore that and we have to move towards an area of peace and understanding and civil discussion, which I feel is quite lacking in the Park. But every discussion
Well,
I've had with you,
I'm part of the ecumenical tradition, so for me.
so you hold yourself accountable to
try
Vatican II.
I try to bridge differences in doctrine between the Catholics, the Protestants, and the Orthodox.
But do you hold yourself to Vatican II?
No, because I'm not actually a Catholic, right? I'm a Roman Catholic, so I don't hold
You're not a
myself
Roman Catholic.
to that.
Okay.
But I would try to encourage unity among
Yeah, but
denominations.
like the Vatican, is trying to encourage unity amongst Muslims and Christians.
It
says that they worship the same God.
Wait, slightly, yeah.
They says that we worship the same God, right? According to Vatican II, implies that heavily.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah. But then how can you be ecumenical with Catholics and Protestants and not be ecumenical with Muslims?
Because I think that Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox worship the same God. Muslims,
But
I think it's a different.
the Vatican says that they worship. The Vatican is the authority of the Roman. The Vatican is the authority of Roman Catholicism,
Indeed,
right?
yes, it is.
And it says they worship the same God as Muslims.
Yeah.
So how can you be ecumenical with Catholics and not be ecumenical with Muslims?
I can call for unity, but still have disagreements in theology. Like ecumenical doesn't mean we just sort of like all merge. What ecumenical really means is like as a part of the body of Christ, I want to focus on primary doctrines. I want to affirm that Christ is the Son of God incarnate, that he was born of a virgin, that he lived a sinless life, that he died on the cross, that he rose again 3 days later, and then he ascended to the Father.
Do you see Muslims worship the same God in some way, shape, or form?
There are too many differences. I think Allah is in a sense a different God.
But then aren't you making takfir in a way on the Vatican?
I disagree with them. Yeah.
So you disagree with the Vatican?
Oh, of course, yeah. I disagree.
But then you're disagreeing. Like Catholicism is the Vatican, right? Sorry, I just want. This is very important.
Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, Roman Catholicism is the Vatican.
Catholicism just means universal.
Sure. Yeah, like we talked about earlier, right? But Roman Catholicism is the Vatican, right?
Yeah.
The Vatican, which is Roman Catholicism, is saying that they worship the same God as the Muslims, right? And we need to talk with Muslims in a peaceful manner on positive things, and we shouldn't go back to like historical issues, right? So, like, if you disagree with the Vatican that Muslims worship the same God as Roman Catholics, then you're not worshiping the same God as the Roman Catholics.
Well, no, I just disagree with what the council said.
But the council, like papal infallibility, right? Like I thought, like you can't go against the council and be a Roman Catholic. So, like, if you believe that Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox worship the same God, you can't believe that if you believe you worship the same God as the Catholics, you have to believe you worship the same God as the Muslims.
I just have to think that the Roman Catholic position is wrong on that. That's fine.
So they're wrong. But then you don't worship the same God as the Catholics. It's a clear logical.
No, I think that we do. I just think they're wrong when they think that the Muslim God is the same God.
But the Pope is saying that, right?
Yeah, I think it's wrong.
So the Pope's wrong, right?
Yes.
So the Pope. Okay, if I say I worship, okay, I'm not even going to go there because that's like. But if the Pope says he worships the same God as Muslims, and you say you don't worship the same God as Muslims, you and the Pope are not worshiping the same God.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. So you can't be ecumenical with Catholics if you're going to be so anti-Muslim.
Ecumenical doesn't mean complete agreement on that.
Yeah, but this is about like the main thing, Tawheed. Like this is the fundamental thing, right? Like you're saying. I mean,
Well, actually,
you see the logical.
the reason why I say that's wrong is because I think the Pope is mistaken when he thinks it's the same thing. He is actually worshipping the same God as like the Protestants and the Orthodox are. It's just that he's confused about what the Muslim God is. He thinks it's the same as. That's how I resolve that.
Okay.
Anyway,
Okay, interesting way of resolving
I need
it.
to go now.
All right, no worries,
Thank you
take
very
care.
much for the conversation. Do you want to do a wrap up?
No, yeah, sure. So we talked about me and Chris, right? Chris? Yeah, we talked about early Christianity, the link between early Christianity and pagan Rome at the time, the historical context in which early Christianity arose. We talked about some of the early Roman emperors, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, a bit of Nero as well, and yeah, it was an interesting discussion. We talked about the way we should apply historical methods to scripture, and yeah, we just towards the end there we talked about ecumenicalism and how, like, I want to build bridges with Christians, but Christians in the park seem to not want to build bridges with Muslims, even though Vatican II says that we should push towards working together, we should push towards having civil discussions with each other, as we did today, which I agree. And as Vatican II says that Christians, Catholics, Roman Catholics worship the same God as the Muslims. So you can't take the position that Protestants and Catholics worship the same gods, but Muslims don't, worship the same God, but Muslims don't, because that's just logic. So yeah, take care. Yeah, sure, go ahead. All right, thank you. Take care.